Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Kelly Montana. I'm the assistant curator here at the Menil Drawing Institute, and thank you all for joining us this evening for a talk with acclaimed poet, novelist, and artist Renee Gladman. This program is presented as part of On Drawing, a programming initiative of the Menil Drawing Institute, which addresses topics ranging from the history, theory, criticism, and materiality of drawing. Tonight, we're thrilled to welcome Renee for a talk that will explore how she welcomed drawing into her practice and how it emerged from a long-established and celebrated prose and poetry writing. Our thanks goes out to Roberto Tejada, distinguished professor at the University of Houston, for connecting us with Renee a few years back. We had originally hoped to welcome Renee to the Menil in spring 2020, but we don't need to go down what happened then. But of course, plans were thwarted. So we're especially thrilled that we're finally able to bring us all together and have Renee here in Houston. Before we get started, a few housekeeping. Masks are requested this evening and are available, so if you don't have one, please do consider it. But I see many of you did, so thank you for that. And if you haven't already done so, please do silence your cell phones. Again, please do silence your cell phones. Take a moment to do it. Renee will begin the program with a presentation, and then I will join her for a short discussion, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So please hold your questions. We'll have someone coming around with a microphone, and you can ask at that time. This program is being recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing on the Menil's YouTube page in the upcoming weeks, so you can revisit and share with all your friends who, for whatever reason, good and bad, are not here with us tonight. Copies of some of Renee's recent titles are available for purchase at the Menil bookstore, and thanks to Renee, several signed copies will be available. So the bookstore won't be open after tonight's program, but you know where to find it. If not, ask any of us here. We'll help you get there. You can call them, reserve your copy, etc. But we're really grateful to have all those there, so thank you, Renee. And I would now like to invite the Houston-based poet Joy Priest to the podium to introduce Renee Gladman to you all. Priest is the author of Horsepower, which was selected by U.S. Poet Laureate Natasha Trethewey for the Donald Hall Prize for Poetry, and she's also a recipient of a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts. You may have seen her work previously. She's received commissions from the MFAH, from the Los Angeles County Museum of Arts, and we're very lucky to have her here in Houston while she is completing her doctoral work at the University of Houston's Program for Literature and Creative Writing. I will add, I had the pleasure of participating in a workshop alongside Joy today, and she's a really generous thinker and a really insightful observer, so it's a real pleasure to know you, Joy. And with that, I'd like to welcome you to the stage.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you to Professor Tejada for asking me to think about Renee's work and share my thoughts with you all. In the spirit of this morning's workshop and Renee's auto essays, I just, if you haven't read Calamities, you should definitely read that. I just sort of let the messy, coiled, tendrilytic sentences in my head just be, and I didn't try to over determine it. So this is called Tonight I Have to Write a Poem About Frederick Douglass, or Sentences as Portals Out of Enclosure. When I look at the work of Renee Gladman, I'm visited by one of the perennial concerns of the poet: the relationship between words and image. Several years ago, on a winter island with 10 painters, I can be heard saying, "Poets are visual artists too. We make images. Our material is words." Perhaps the holiest thing you can do as a poet is make an image: a sonic image, a textual image, a textural image, a scent image, a visual image, a desire image, a skyline. I hope Renee has hit that bend on Westheimer where it swerves northeast at the anvil, right at sunset, when the 80s sci-fi skyline is suddenly ablaze in something that could only be described as glory. When words fail to represent everything, Gladman turns to image. She makes an image with not words, but the representation of words. She represents words via tangled coils of script that sometimes is soil, sometimes is substrate, sometimes is portal, sometimes is skyline, always is structure to hold the everything of it when words cannot. The relationship between words and image, how to use one to get over to the other, to make nothing out of something, to make a way out of no way. When I think about the work of Renee Gladman, I think of Mahalia Jackson asking how we got over. My soul looks back and wonders how I got over, she sings. How to get over seems to be the kind of question Gladman is concerned with, or the attempt to get over, if how to get over is a way to describe process. Abstract drawing can do the work language can't always do, Gladman said this morning in a workshop. When we get into language, we get into making sense. Her triumvirate, as she calls it, of architecture, writing, and drawing can, quote, work to create openings or thresholds. It can bring the huge simultaneous nexus pulsing in the interior into exterior space, into language, into one single line, without commenting on the getting from here to there. How do we get that huge pulsing it from the interior spiritual space over to the material realm? How did Frederick Douglass get over the soil to the skyline, get from here to there? What was his portal? He leaves that in what Gladman calls non-knowing. Mahalia's portal was God. Gladman's portals are cities of script, buildings, page as substrate of ink, spirit as substrate of song. These portals will constitute the loop inside the map and will give the map levity, writes Gladman in Plans for Sentences. These sentences will balance the question of movement against that of enclosure, will slant the rise against the cleave, and will add a portal to what you've been saying. For Gladman, drawing creates the portal when saying isn't enough, the portal as a way through from the spiritual interior to the material external. Gladman's line is the sentence. Through it, she offers us not a record of what was done, but a litany of what will be done. Gladman's anaphoric lines manifest making. They manifest making a way out of no way through portals, loops, and swerves hidden in the map in her cities of sentences. The enclosure is so brutal, says the speculative archivist Sadia Hartman in conversation with Fred Moten, Gladman's collaborator. Is there a refuge in the sentence? Is there an underground railroad in the sentence? Moten asked in the afterword to Prose Architectures. What did Douglass think after he'd made it through that portal of which nothing is known and found himself standing in front of the buildings of New York? These dense woods will hold the history of where we mossed and where we blacken, writes Gladman. Sentences as glory, sentences as substrate of errantry. These sentences will tend the slow cleaving of the field. These curved enclosures will swerve us into an elsewhere. What these sentences say, though, is not known. Renee Gladman was born in Atlanta, Georgia. She is a writer and artist preoccupied with crossings, thresholds, and geographies as they play out at the intersections of poetry, prose, drawing, and architecture. Her visual work regards the drawing space as a kind of laboratory for thinking about writing, how writing emerges from the body, how narrative moves and takes shape below the semantic level. She is the author of 14 published works, including a cycle of novels, the essay collection Calamities, and 3 collections of drawings, Prose Architecture, One Long Black Sentence, a series of white ink drawings on black paper indexed by Fred Moten, and Plans for Sentences, her most recent collection of drawings published this year. Recent essays and visual work have appeared in Poetry Magazine, the Paris Review, Gulf Coast, Granta, Harper's, Bomb Magazine, eFlux, and N+1. She has been awarded fellowships, artist grants, and residencies from the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. the Foundation for Contemporary Arts, the Lannan Foundation, and the Ravickian Institute for Contemporary Art in Berlin. And she is a 2021 Wyndham Campbell Prize winner in fiction. Please welcome Renee Gladman.
Good evening, everyone. Joy, thank you so much for that introduction. That was incredible. You did so much of the work that I was worried I would have to do, so that helps. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm really grateful for you all coming and for dealing with the mask for an hour. I really appreciate it and hope it's not too uncomfortable. This has been a dream of mine for a long time. When I love drawing, all the questions, particularly abstract drawings. I have many artists who are my favorites, whose books I collect, and I remember a few years ago when I saw that there was that the Menil was opening the Drawing Institute. I just was so utterly just pleased and encouraged, that there would be this understanding that there needed to be a place where we thought about what drawing was and what it did, and we looked at drawings and we built this kind of cathedral to drawing. So I'm really happy to be here. So grateful to Lauren Pollock and Tony Martinez for their help in getting me here, and for Kelly, who I'm so excited to talk to in a little bit. So I'm going to kind of go between things that I've written down to say and things that I will hopefully improvise in saying. My lip balm is broken. You gotta have the smooth lips. Can't have the smooth thoughts without the smooth lips. Okay. So while the title of tonight's event is on drawing, I have never thought it to myself without adding the word writing, as in on drawing writing, or in another moment thinking on writing drawing, or later saying drawn writing. Because having brought the two together almost 10 years ago, they are to me now inextricable. And these variations, drawn writing, writing drawing, drawn writings, sometimes I refer to myself as a writer of drawings. These attest to the questions that inspired this dual practice in the first place. And those are, how can I go on writing without writing? How can I experience language as a nervous system, see it move, expand, react as energy, as an intelligence? How can I look mechanically at the way narrative builds and moves and decomposes? How can I talk about the way lines and marks, both intentional and accidental, make portals in the world, create bridges to unknowns and elsewheres? These are my questions, and they have led to many artist book projects, many wall drawings, many essays, and a couple of novels. So this evening I want to focus on 3 entanglements in particular. I will start with the recent book that Joy mentioned, Plans for Sentences, which for the first time in my writing drawing life allows text and image to sit next to one another. Something I'd been averse to for a long time, wanting to avoid that sort of one-to-one relationship of A being an illustration of B, or B to A, etc. Next, I will show some of my black paper drawings for the book, these comprising scores, maths, and a series of inventions I call whatchamacalls. And while I show them, I'll read from an essay on non-knowing, another important aspect in my writing, drawing life. And I'll finish by reading an essay which tries to tell a story of writing, drawing, and reading at once. And it's possible that I will have run out of time by then, so I may just excerpt that essay and I'll tell you where to find it if you want to finish it. Okay, so I will start with Plans for Sentences. I am showing you both the drawings and the text so that you get to experience them both in sort of process of being made. And I just decided to read the first 10 from the book, so you're not getting into the part of the book where there's color. And so these are the first iterations in that project, Plans for Sentences. I'll show you the drawings for a couple seconds and then switch to the figure. Figure 1. These sentences will ache a massive threading of forms and will not know knowing. These will emerge from grain, they will out and open, they will over and back and open, they will edge and cross and grain. These sentences will blacken the substrate, they will go the furthest and speak the loudest in a blurred cartography. They will rise and will blacken the plain and will hold. Figure 2. These sentences will flood the plain in a repetition of walls and living. They will bend through the scaffold and flatten as they rise and be a floor for sky. These sentences will grow the field against the substrate in a theory of hills, and they will spire. They will have the one thing leaning and the other thing sloping and will divide the plain just below the densest language and will launch the language of the grain. Figure 3. These sentences will breathe, not breathing, will flow and blacken in the gathering. These sentences will shoal in their linearity. They will march to void and march to blacken. They will edge and thicken and double the horizon. They will blacken. These sentences will void at the plane 4 times, wash out the ground twice, stutter twice, elongate. They will prolong the horizon. Figure 4. These sentences will flute and fold where the chapter crusts with questions. They will grain into a geometry of support, the history of something burrowing. These flutes will barge the void. They will silo and gather in horns draping and will take your place of speaking. They will erupt from the surface in an alternative mode of pointing and will stand variously and voidly under impulse to curve and flute. They will curve and flute without history. Figure 5. These sentences will shade the block. They will form the substrate and shade. They will find their peaks and flutter in the corner. They will shade and flutter. These will climb the substrate. They will roll. They will roll and go quiet. They will roll a line burning into the surface. They will over backward and will over the start and over the interruption. They will roll and square the void. These sentences will strain the curve against the graining, the diagonal against the curve, and will burn equidistant to what unfolds. They will form a scaffold of ascending and descending clauses and will know space. They will not know space. Figure 6. These sentences will be housed among paragraphs that roll and grain. They will move vertically toward the sky, will grain, will void, amassing tiny statements. These will crust a scaffold, will chapter the sight as it strides, and will write the unwritten without pause. They will encumber to void. These sentences will cover the horizon from end to end as a kind of castellation of grains and threads and portals. These portals will constitute the loop inside the map and will give the map levity. Figure 7. These sentences will balance the question of movement against that of enclosure, will slant the rise against the cleave, and will add a portal to what you've been saying. They will out and cleave. These sentences will enact a small striation of fields, a thinning of surfaces. These sentences will move through other sentences in some accord of gravity and rotation. They will detour at the escapements, then tunnel out to void. These sentences will have erupted from the plain among the ruins of several burnt-out bunkers, your silo farm, and they will grain from the earth, each with a bending horizon and one vector pointing to space. They will cluster and contort. These will have gone up a thin line and bent, just going right and bending, then reaching up, growing something, will grow a question and a side to the question, some stutter, and a period at the top. And I think I will just show you these last ones. This is drawing. This is the figure. Just gonna move ahead. Figure 9. And then I will read 10. Figure 10, these places will operate inside a thinning that brushes against the void. They will up and over and grain. They will slow and curve. They will blacken and sway in extended durations, fields of tiny neighboring enclosures. They will spire threaded towers, and behind them highs will rise, belonging to language, but not these sentences of any language, and not this language in particular. These sentences will gather all the pauses in a flowing assembly into a speech that is only the comma and will hold time as it distills and blackens in equation. So one of the things that makes me happy about this book is all of the impossible relationships it creates between what is signified and what is the signifier. To begin with, these are plans, which means they are proposals for a future thing, in this case, sentences. Yet when I named this series in 2016, it only comprised drawings. So these plans for sentences were always drawings. A couple of years later, I wrote the figures and named them descriptions of future sentences, and really wanted them to be both an activation of the drawing space as well as a way of making shapes for sentences that have yet arrived, such that both the drawn and written spaces are attending to things that are not quite here, not quite located. In my mind, each page is at once a drawing and a sentence, and I'm interested in what I learn about each by looking at both. I have to say one of my favorite activities as a writer and artist is moving between what is and what appears to be isn't. And I realize I should, this has a really sort of, this works equally in my writing as well as the drawings, that there is a large problem that happens in the 4th novel of the Ravicka series. There's a scientist who's called a geoscographer, whose job it is to sort of measure the locations of the buildings in Ravicka because they migrate. It's a long story as to why they move, but her job is to keep track of the buildings, and one of the buildings that she's assigned to take notations on is missing. And the building that is its cousin, which sort of like helps lock it in place, is actually one of the invisible buildings of Ravicka. And so it isn't where it is supposed to be, but, or it isn't where it's supposed to not be appropriately, but because it isn't there in relation to what should be there, it creates this kind of inability to kind of locate where the solid building actually is. And so I got really excited about this problem once I realized I didn't have to actually solve it, but I could sort of solve it fictionally by inventing a sort of science around it. So I got really excited about this idea of fictional knowing, that you can invent a math, or you can invent a place, you can invent a language, and sort of have that operate in a way that you can't with things that are already codified. And the way that that's sort of is important to me as a person in the world and as a writer and as an artist is often, as I was saying in the workshop today, when you're creating, there is this feeling that there is you and your body and your desire to write, and then there are these sort of other places that you don't necessarily see, but that pressures the work that you create, so that there's a sense of like elsewheres or other knowledges or other material that's not necessarily part of this world, but that's a part of the work that you create. So I think of this is like non-visible material. I sometimes say this process as non-knowing, a way of allowing yourself to create without necessarily knowing where you're going or what your material is. So I want to share some of these, as I mentioned, these black paper drawings, and the black space really helps me think about the unknown and the idea of when you're writing or when you're drawing, you are drawing into a space that is opaque in a lot of different ways, both physically and both visually and intellectually in a lot of different ways. So I think there's about 8 of these, and they're timed to the piece I'm reading. I began the day thinking how we can go from knowing to not knowing in an instant. We can go from knowing to not knowing back to knowing in the length of an instant. Across an instant, we can take what we know and turn it into not knowing, and then we can know the not knowing. It could be an instant no longer than the stretch from A to B, or that pause following the equal sign, the breath after the comma, that kind of instant where the light takes over the day, illuminates the whole expanse of your breathing, and sets you on a path to glory. And then in the space of a comma, clouds come and cover, and suddenly it's a very ordinary day, no glory in sight. And just as you're about to turn your mind towards some sleepy activity, not yet doing it, but making its duration possible in your mind, the sun returns, the sky clears, and you can see a sliver of the moon in broad daylight. You can go from knowing to not knowing just as quickly as you can go from not knowing to knowing, even though the thing you are now knowing came directly from what you hadn't known. You didn't know it because it first wasn't real. It wasn't anything, it was fiction. Fiction is a category of not knowing. You walked proudly through it. But not knowing doesn't last as long as knowing, and that's why you tried to not know for as long as you could and threw all these things in your path, so that your path to knowing was full of things that made you confused and sleepy. I put something in front of my not knowing. It was a line made from a blue pastel stick. I drew the line, then pulled my finger through it. I wrote PPP at its bottom right corner to put sound to my not knowing. I wanted it to be very soft. I wanted the moment to last as long as it could, so drew a deep orange line above the blue and ran my finger through it. I didn't know what I was doing with the not knowing. It was almost as if I wanted to make the not knowing look like knowing so that I could know it. In that moment, I wanted to know not knowing. I made an equation, dv something something. I wrote C parentheses R close parentheses, I wrote. I drew a line in ink, then wrote PPP beneath the swiped through blue and orange lines. I turned the orange and blue from lines into sectors, into veils. I wrote X, then squared it. I placed next to it DV. I put DV in parentheses, then squared it too. I was performing knowing on the not knowing within the blurry veil of orange and blue. I wrote PPP to make it quiet. I was trying to get to a place where the instant I realized I was not knowing, my not knowing changed. It got louder, then quiet. I wanted math to be about how not knowing had a shape, and then I wanted the shape to have something like a cloak you could put over it and place inside a fiction. It would walk around your fiction and no one would know it was math underneath. But a math about something that was categorically outside the realm of knowing, but still known because it was math or looked like math. You could write something that looked like something else, that said it was something else while not looking like it. You could write something earnest that tried to say clearly that it was something looking at something else. You could write something else. You could sleep. You could add VLN to your math, then DV, then PPP. I drew a thin diagonal line in white ink and put an arrow at its end. I returned to the origin of that line and along its left side, moving incrementally upward. I began making short perpendicular lines extending from it, like arm hairs standing on end. Halfway up, I stopped and returned again to the origin of the diagonal, but now moved to the other side of the perpendicular lines. I drew another diagonal line close off the shorter, choppy ones, too long, beautiful, sharp lines drawn in white ink, connected by many measured, short perpendicular lines that carried halfway up the two lines, both diagonals ending with arrows. I finished the equation with a long line extending perpendicularly from the first diagonal, but on its right side with no arrow, disappearing into the veil, the blank space of the black sheet upon which something else had become something forward and something climbing, something figured, something knowing run through something blue. It was all this not knowing that needed to be charted. It had made itself too known to me. And although it was not knowing that was taking over everything, it took up space as if it were known. It needed to be charted. It had to have its own math. Okay. So I guess I read this much faster when I was practicing. So at this point, I've shown you what I call drawings for the books, and that means these are works that are ranged from like 8 by 10 to the books and the drawings and plans for sentences are 11 by 14, and I really think of them because of the scale as a kind of way of writing. It feels like a kind of continuation of the page and a way of sort of extending the page. But I did want to show you some of the wall drawings. So this is an install view from a show that's up currently called The Dreams of Sentences. It's at the Zilka Gallery at Wesleyan. This is my first solo show. So there's like about 40 pieces in this show. The pieces in the vitrines are from the books, and then these are pieces on the walls. And I thought I would sort of let you hang out with this one to the right, which is called Prose 2019. It's 30 by 44, and I just want to show you, this is a detail of it so that you can think about this not being what you're hearing. And then this is the drawing that I will leave up while I finish off. This piece is called Untitled Environments, and I am gonna, unfortunately for me, excerpt it because I want us to have time to talk. This is a piece in which I wanted to think about, I said earlier, writing, reading, and drawing, but also at the end of the, I talk about that for a page or so, and then I start to incorporate quotations from some of the writers and the artists whose works are really important to me. So it becomes this kind of environment of presences. So I won't be able to share that, but that is there. I began the day wanting to bring into convergence 3 activities of being: what I'd seen, what I'd read, and what I'd drawn, and to say about these acts how they made lines in the world that ran alongside other lines, and how all these lines together made environments of the earth where I could put my body and you could put yours. And these would be lines always entwined because there was little, if anything, you could say or make without calling forth other lines. And this was how you knew you were where you were and the ground was worth cultivating and that there was life beneath the ground. I spent a long time looking into each of the acts of how I'd been in the world, how I'd conveyed that I'd been there. And I found all these overlapping currents and found that each of the acts divided into further acts, like acts of writing and making narrative, which divided into acts of building and afforestation, which then led to sex and led to reading and wandering. I have found in drawing a way to think about narrative such that I could look into narrative without writing narrative and could see something about what it did and didn't have to place periods in it anywhere and didn't have to give details or unfold events, but could be in a narrative space, a space being built by narrative. And I could say this was happening because I was moving my hand across a page and I had a pen in my hand. I had a pen in my hand, and for a long time or a short time, I'd move it across the page and think or not think about narrative, what it meant to be a narrative, to feel narrative gather in my body and feel it work to move out of my body. But I'd be making a drawing, and yet as I drew, I was often conscious of the resemblance of the lines of drawing to those I made when writing. The resemblance was the sun at the bottom of the drawing page. I was trying to invert a city to suggest a dense landscape, and the presence of this sun kept me cognizant that all the time I was drawing, I was doing a kind of writing that in its duration was drawing, in its shape was writing, and narrative pulsed at the core of all this. The ink was the core of narrative. My hand was the core. The shape my hand made was the core. And I knew when I was saying narrative that I wasn't limiting it to some event happening inside fiction, but rather was trying to get at an energy, a light that threaded all my acts of reading and writing and drawing and seeing into a day, then days. I'll stop there. Thank you so much. Anyone in particular, or just?
I think the last one's nice.
Okay. I'm gonna leave it there so there's a little light.
Renee, thank you so much. Where to start? I think where I want to start, though, is when I first came across your drawings, it was Prose Architectures. And it was seeing this immersion of word and building and the way they were dense and airy. There was something about it that I sensed you were speaking to the real conditions of navigating space, life. And what I want to add to that from what you just shared with us is that it was the real conditions of not knowing. It was the real conditions of searching. And I guess I'll just start with that observation.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I think also what was real, so Prose Architectures is I started in 2013 as the first book in the series of works I've done since where I consciously felt that when I was drawing, I was also writing. And I started this book because I had finished the third book in the Ravicka series, and it was a book in which the narrator said architecture a lot, and was constantly writing books in this novel. And I really felt like I hadn't done the work, or like the thing that I wanted to happen with architecture hadn't happened, like with saying that word. So like the two sort of combine this desire to figure out how to get architecture to open inside of narrative for me, but also this feeling of like really wanting to keep the feeling of writing, or like touch it or have some kind of contact with it, which is really difficult to do when you're literally writing, because you can't really sort of feel the energy of that while you're building. So these drawings for me were this way of kind of lifting that top layer of sentence making off and sort of looking down into language. And to me, like at the time I hadn't thought about this, I wasn't really using the word non-knowing, but I think that sort of qualifies most of my work, which is this sense of, I mentioned this earlier in the workshop, of discovery, and not discovery in a sense of collecting, discovering, having a revelation and sort of like putting it away in a chest of knowledges, but just like that, what it feels like to be in a moment where something opens, or something moves, or something shifts. I feel that somehow that is urgent to my living, that I continue to put myself in places where there is a lot of pressure from things that don't quite make sense or aren't quite clear, and then there's this kind of movement toward those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a really wonderful image to have up, because again, speaking about putting yourself in places of unknowing and discovery, there's a remarkable variety of materials and a sense of experimentation and moving through different kinds of instruments and papers. Can you just talk a little bit about those hinges, or what draws you to create a body of work on a black paper to add color? What does that moment look like when it arrives?
Yeah, the first time I used color, I was so conflicted. It was still in the Prose Architecture series. And, these are similar to the plans for sentences, but I would say kind of more sparse, because I hadn't started kind of building the densities yet. So they were still interested in like a quick writing that sort of made a shape that seemed somewhat architectural. And at some point in the drawings, actually, I think about 200 drawings into it, I took I think it was just like a colored crayon pencil, and just made a line And it just blew my mind because it first looked like suddenly like the drawing had become a logo or a design, and I had to really think about what color does, or like how it belongs in this kind of lexicon that I had created. But now color to me is this really comforting, another kind of portal that allows. So if I'm still thinking about the drawings as kind of writings, color is just totally interrupts that and layers that, because color doesn't necessarily belong within the kind of writing world or space or form of thinking. And a lot of the drawings are, I have like a collection of fountain pens and art pens. So like I really, a part of these drawings came out of this feeling of not wanting to have to give up handwriting, and feeling the way that thought moves through the body, comes out of the hand, is so integral to writing, and you still feel that when you're typing, but just this sense of being able to enact it with the pen and with the ink. So I just, I love those materials. I just, and I love the different papers and yes, I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, and listening to you today brings back this quote that I've loved, but honestly haven't thought about in forever. And I should have actually checked it because I've been thinking about it so much. But I think it's Derrida, and he has he curated a show about drawings about blindness. And he has this line where he talks about drawing having like a miner's light at the end of a tunnel, and like at the end of your finger is this miner's light. And you just bringing that, the way you bring kind of drawing to life and these unexpected images just made me think of that quote today. Again, that kind of searching sense of discovery and being in darkness and finding light. I also want to ask, you kind of were started to speak of it, of when a series or when a sequence of drawings finds color, when you find these unexpected moments, and you have drawings that are in some ways kind of memorialized into a book in a certain sequence. Do you think of them as being drawings that should always exist in that sequence? Is series a way to think about certain bodies of work, or do you see a different relationship between these sheets that those words don't encompass?
I definitely feel that the smaller drawings, it's easier to think of them in series. I mean, I do them in series, and I think that that's because there is a sense of trying to get somewhere or create a kind of field of thinking, which I don't feel that I can do with one drawing. And I think the way that I write my novels in series, the way that Calamities is like a series of these essays that I began the day. I think that really helps me both sort of create a sense of the daily, but also there is so much, also once I start, like there's so much desire to keep going. But I don't want to do too much within one space. But the larger drawings feel very different to me. All of the drawings to me are part of a project in which I'm thinking about like this idea of prose architectures or paragraph drawings. But the larger drawings creates a totally different time for making the mark. And for being in my body in relation to that paper. And those feel like more singular experiences because of the time. It's more work to create those surfaces, et cetera. Yeah.
That's really interesting to think about it as a field of thinking, and it really does become this very large and encompassing body of work. But yet each one of these sheets has such remarkable restraint in it. It seems like you really have this wonderful sense of when there is this sense of completeness, even though it's really leaving a lot of reserve on the paper. There's a lot of potentiality still there. That's kind of that you just leave it. You leave it alone on each sheet. Can you just speak a little bit about to this sense of restraint in one, but then this kind of deluge in quantity, both in sheets and language at times, and
That's
how you build
interesting.
your.
I mean, because I'm trying to think about it in relation to writing, because we are, to build a text, you're always leaving things out. I mean, every text is a kind of fragment because you can't say everything, and you can't really time all the things that you're thinking with the way that you are able to kind of put it into language and into that sort of progressing line. And so I'm always thinking about this idea that to write or to express yourself at all is a kind of compression. And that, even when we try to talk about an experience, like pull something from memory, it's like always already kind of, I don't say broken because it's not negative necessarily, but it's a fragment, and it's also sort of like, always a kind of revision of what actually happened. And so I think that translates to the drawing, and I think that I'm equally not super attentive to that part. I mean, I'm not thinking like, I'm not thinking restraint when I'm working. I'm thinking, for me, to put a sentence in space or to make a mark on the page is to introduce a problem of space, and then the next mark I make is to address that problem, and then you build, like an architecture is built out of that, or an essay is built out of that, and I think of them sort of in the same way. But it's hard to sort of figure out what the restrained part is. I think it's kind of natural to the practice.
That's really interesting. And I think I'm also someone that thinks a lot about the entanglements of writing and drawing. And one thing that I find so beautiful in your framing of kind of the divisions or the convergences of them is that it seems to me that you're not so interested in like what writing can't do or what drawing can't do. You're rather more like, why would you make writing do that? Why would you make drawing do this? It's kind of like releasing certain burdens of each of them, as opposed to seeing them as failed in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me it's more that I see drawing in writing, and I see writing and drawing, and I would be insane to try to keep them away from each other at this point. It really, when I'm doing like either of these drawings, when I'm making these texts that look like writing, it really feels like I have breached some kind of wall that is supposed to be there between, using language and producing language, and this is a space in which I'm inside of it. I'm in this kind of energy field, and I feel it both after doing the drawing and coming back to the writing. You can tell by the kind of loopiness of the language that that movement and shape of the line has infected the writing, and then now it's very difficult to write without thinking about the making shapes and thinking about like the behavior of narrative, or thinking about that this text I'm writing is a drawing. And so it just feels, it's more like I feel them magnetized towards each other and have just completely surrendered to their attraction or their entanglement. So, yeah.
I really love thinking about approaching kind of the space of the page as either approaching it as about to write or about to drawing as being a similar kind of mapping the space of the page. But I am curious, you mentioned that you're sensing something different if you go bigger. Can you just speak to that a little bit, what you're feeling in this moment that feels like it's kind of portending? Can you speak a little bit about to this space of unknowing, I suppose?
I just feel that if I'm working on a smaller scale, I feel that I'm writing into a kind of, I most definitely am aware and feel and am excited that I'm drawing, but I also feel that this is a kind of text that exists in relation, I don't want to say text, but it's a kind of writing that exists in relation to things that I've written and things I'm thinking about from the writing perspective. And lately, I think when I start to go on that larger page, it feels more like landscape, like I'm drawing like a landscape, and so it's less about the page or the book, even though it's still that writing experience, and it's more about sort of like building space or building environments and trying to think about the again, like this problem of space, how now that I've made these few marks, can I keep building and using my sort of like, somewhat small grouping of, my lexicon to keep working this page until I feel like a space has been made. So it feels like I am still in a kind of architectural environment, but it feels more like land or expanse. That's slightly different from the smaller drawings.
Very interesting. And I guess this will be my last question before we turn it over to all of you, is I didn't realize the increasing frequency with which your drawings have started to encompass things like math and notation, and again, just going back to that sense of kind of, I'll use the word restraint again, though I'm not sure that's quite as fitting anymore. Just the elegance, like kind of the balancing that I see, the balancing act that I see in these drawings, and the balancing that also happens in energies and equations and math. So can you? I'd be curious to hear a little bit about the turn to incorporate this kind of lexicon in your work.
Yeah, when I was at Radcliffe in, I think it was 2014, 2015, one of the fellows that I really connected with was a composer, Mauricio Pauli, and he does like electronics and also kind of like avant-garde classical. I don't know if that's what he would call it, but it felt that way to me. And he started reading my novels and like writing a score towards it, and I think he titled it "The Buildings Between Us," which is a quote from one of the novels. And I just remember being in his studio and looking at his score, and I got really excited about the idea of, it was almost like a kind of return gesture to him that I wanted to think about. Similar when I talk about sort of how excited I get about incidental marks on the wall, how they feel like there's all this kind of pressure around them, that they are themselves a kind of artwork, or at least a portal into other places or other ways of thinking about that space that you're looking at. I feel that music, sound, does a similar thing, again, that language can't quite do, where it points to something that is an elsewhere. Music lets you kind of enter or be in a way that is sort of out of time and out of this narrative that belongs to the logic of language. And so I began making these scores on the black paper, which was a way of the black representing this kind of powerful non-knowing. So it's not a lack, it's just a thing that remains on the other side that I want to keep there. And that if I put musical notations to these drawings and give them to a composer, when I'm lucky, a composer, musician connects with them and tries to play them. And then when I hear the music, I feel like they are bringing something back from that elsewhere and delivering it. And I just think that's a really incredible experience. And so naturally, I would then find the math in that paper and try to pull that out as well. I was telling the students in the workshop today, I love math. I love the equations, just the gesture of figuration, and I was like the worst math student in the world, and still am, but just love building these equations, and I feel pretty happy about it in terms of, being, like, taking up that space of thinking in the drawings. And I haven't heard from many mathematicians about how, like, grossly terrible I am at it, but to me, it's just really beautiful to put these letters and equal signs and all kinds of stuff together. So it's this way of enacting or pointing to, again, that sort of powerful non-knowing that pressures everything for me. Yeah.
Thank you, Renee.
Thank you for
of
that.
course. We'll take a few questions from the audience now. There's a microphone coming around. Tony, looks like we have a question right up front here.
Thank you, Renee.
Pleasure.
Kelly. I'm going to take the invitation on this idea of restraint and link it to the title of your exhibition that's now at Wesleyan, which is The Dreams of Sentences. And I can't help but think that sentences are both the unit of thought and writing, but it's also a kind of legalistic term, right? A verdict of some sort. But maybe what I really want to ask is, as you're in the space now of the gallery, how you think of sequencing and the interior space as a way of constructing a sentence as well in the gallery space or in the walls of a museum.
Yeah. It's a great question. I've been thinking about this a lot because when I was trying to think of a title, and when I came up with the Dreams of Sentences, something just like settled in me. It was this really beautiful, intense moment where I felt like something. I've been thinking about that, like sentences dreaming of themselves, sentences sort of making shape outside of and away from whatever I might want them to be doing. And maybe that's a part of the writing where, you know, a reader, that moment where they are, you know, feel like they fall in love with the work or really feel moved by a work. Maybe those are the moments where the sentences are sort of like doing their own work, or dreaming themselves into space. And so it feels amazing to kind of walk into the gallery space and see these pieces, which were just beautifully framed, and just the way they handled the whole process was a gift, and feel the power of the lines in the drawing separate from me creating their own architectures. So that feels. That's astonishing, but I did find that I have a kind of limit where I am less invested in how the pieces are hung. Like I had opinions about certain of the walls, but I really felt like my person Danielle, the curator, I really let them sort of come to the final arrangement of the pieces, because for some reason that's actual math. That's not like the beautiful math that I love. And so it was interesting to see that. I mean, they are all looking at the wall and trying to figure out if it should go over, and then my back is to the drawings, and I'm looking out the window because it's like the other wall where the drawings aren't hung is outside. It's glass. You can see these beautiful trees, and I was just like, realizing I'm not super interested. I mean, if it's something I don't like, I will say, but it's just interesting to sort of see the limitation in terms of that space where I give that over to someone that I think who cares about the spaces between the different frames. Bless his heart, I would say, if I was in Georgia, where I'm from.
Oh, can you hold for the microphone so we can hear you? Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, thank you. It's absolutely wonderful. I do not know your work, but I will get to know it better. I was so reminded of Calvino's Invisible Cities, and I recently have read the Polish writer whose name I may butcher, sorry, Magdalena Tully. Red is what I'm finishing now, and Dreams and Stones, and I think the other book was Verse. I'm very much reminded of the way in which architectures are created in those narratives. But what I was interested in asking you is, could you talk to us about some of the influences, or really important influences in your work?
In the writing or the drawing?
In any of it.
Well, since you've mentioned Magdalena Tully and Calvino, those both of those writers have been important to, especially to writing the Ravicka series, where Julio Cortázar is one of my favorite novelists. And what I loved most about his work was that he not only did his stories take place in the city, but he tried to kind of, in each book, formulate a sort of theory for city, or even like a poetics for city. And that was something I was really, really interested in the first couple decades of writing. I really loved city novels, and I could not find enough of them where the city wasn't just like a backdrop, but it was something that sort of had a presence in the work. And so I can't remember the name of the Magdalena Tully novel where there's like a train that keeps circling this square, but it's one of, was it? Verse? Verse. No, it's something else. I can't remember. I mean, if someone said it, I would know it, but I can't remember it right now. I have to look for that book first, because I don't know of it. Yeah. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But within writing, early writing was people like, speaking of restraint, Marguerite Duras, that kind of economy of narration. Samuel Beckett, I've always loved. Samuel Delaney's novels were really important to me in terms of thinking about brown bodies in cities, and thinking about where you can have derailments and interruptions within those narratives. That was really important for me to read it in the context of that. And when I talk about drawing the people who I love the most, Cy Twombly, we visited the gallery for the first time today, and it's just perfect, a lot of it. But I really love the permission that a lot of the paintings give, and just being able to create this space in which a lot of kind of material or information can be pulled through, and from my perspective, doesn't have to have a reason for being there, or doesn't have to have a kind of like logic. I just love the marks and some of them that feel sort of random. Julie Marie too is probably my favorite. Big cities and architectures and things that are kind of exploding. And then Leonardo, because I just love his inventions. I love the look of, I don't try to figure out what he's building or what he's proposing. I just love the look of the shape of the machines that he's building, and how the line works in relation to that. So yeah, those are people who are coming up right now. Thank you for your question. Anybody else?
One last one, anyone?
I had a curious question for you.
Okay, where's the microphone? 1 second.
If you could just raise your hand so Tony can see. There we are. Okay.
Oh, thank you. Primarily, thank you, Renee. I really enjoyed your perception. I liked that you included mathematics in this. I've always been really curious about that as well, and how you made it somewhat relevant, or not somewhat, sorry. You made it relevant to art and your ability with writing as well. My question for you was, when you wrote about the void and, you know, kind of just figuring out the mathematical equations and even designing your own logistics to it all, were you ever curious or ever considered the fact that it could very much be a whole void in the entirety of it all?
What would that mean?
So basically, a void is just like kind of a distraction in a way, how it kind of keeps your mind distilled just within one concept, meaning that, you know, there is something to know, you know, and that's basically kind of just like an affirmative that there is a configuration to it all. You know, you kind of seem convinced at the beginning where there was question and curiosity.
Yeah, I think that's a really complex question that I have to think about. But I should say that, so with plans for sentences, where I'm using that word a lot, I was looking at the drawings before there had been any writing attached to them, and I wanted to name action or appearances or things that I felt in the drawing that didn't necessarily belong to what you were seeing, and that gave it energy or activated it in a particular way. So a lot of, you know, those words, graining is like a word I use to describe when the writing gets really small, and the void was the blank space, the negative space in the drawings was a way to sort of think about the relationship of the where there was text or where there was buildings or whatever, and where there wasn't, and the relationship between those two spaces in the field of the drawing. So, and I don't feel like I have put a lot of meaning behind it, like a lot of necessity behind what that word means. Like, I don't think that I feel that the page is like particularly a void, but I like the idea of there being a space in the drawing that is indeterminate, or that is like so vast that you can't quite name it, or you can't enter it, or, you know, it sort of has its presence itself without needing to be a marker, without needing to be a line, etc. So I think that that's the way it functions in that context. Thank you.
Renee, thank you very much. Thanks all of you
Thank
for
you
attending.
all so much.